Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is the Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof, for the 26th of February 2025. An awful lot to go through. There's stuff coming out consistently about the minerals deal, so I'll give you all the latest on that. There are some comments from Zelensky himself pertaining to the deal, so I think that's very important. We'll get to that in the third section, US section here. We're going to start kind of in terms of general international stuff with Vladimir Putin now dragging Belarus into the war. I did reference this earlier. Next are reports that the Federation Council approved the law on ratification of the treaty between Russia and Belarus on security guarantees within the Union state. The document was submitted for ratification by the Russian President Putin. Under the agreement, the parties undertake to support each other by all means and means agreed and allowed by international law to take appropriate actions in the political, military and other spheres in case of encroachment on the security of either party and the Union state as a whole. This is essentially an Article 5 parallel that we've seen Russia very cleverly sign up with North Korea to allow them, at least according to the law of that bit of paper, to draw North Korean soldiers into Russia to defend Russia from Ukrainian invasions. This looks to be similar, so Belarusians can now be utilised by the Russians as well. Quote, the treaty was signed in Minsk on December the 6th, 2024. The agreement envisages, among other things, the involvement of all forces, including Russian nuclear weapons, for the defence of the Union state. So they're now seen as one state, if you like. And nukes can be used. So that's great. It has to be said that Lukashenko knows that helping Russia in that very explicit manner would not be popular with the people. He's not a popular leader anyway. He's a dictator that's taken that mantle by force, if you like, on account of Russian involvement and interference. That, I mean, he's not stupid, Lukashenko. He knows that he's being propped up by Putin, and that's why he's been very reluctant to go full on in supporting Russia. But signing this deal, I assume he was forced to do so, has meant that he might be called upon to provide troops. That won't be popular. There was an analysis that was this is potentially misremembering the numbers, but it is something like, I think if he was forced to support Russia militarily, that only 30% of his soldiers would do so. Something like that. But again, you know, take that with a pinch of salt, and things change when you're actually called upon by superiors on pain of imprisonment or whatever. So, yeah, interesting. Kyiv Independent reports that Slovak National Party, so one of the coalition partners of the Robert Fico government, of his own Smer party, has called on Fico to apologise after Slovakia backed the UN resolution condemning the Russian aggression against Ukraine. This was a surprise. Serbia did so as well, and then Vucic came out and said, oh, it was a mistake, we didn't mean to do that. Now, I assume that's the real far-right party that's in coalition with Smer, who were notionally centre-left once, but I don't think they are now. They're going on full kind of populist, nationalist policies and agendas. So but they got into bed with the two other parties. One was far right, and I think it's this party that is supportive of Russia, and therefore asking Fico to apologise. The party said an investigation should determine why who authorised the Slovak UN representative to vote that way, according to a Czech news outlet. And Hungary is seeking the removal of 8 names from EU-Russia sanctions list, according to Reuters, highly unsurprising. Hungary are demanding the removal of those from the sanctions list and guarantees on Ukraine's gas transit talks before agreeing to renew restrictions, said Reuters. Now, big news today. I probably should have led with this. I guess this is probably the biggest news, that the Romanian pro-Russian former presidential candidate Georgescu will actually, he's not former presidential candidate, he is in the lead, I believe, looking at some polls. He's been detained. His car was stopped on the road. He was then sent for questioning to the Prosecutor General's office. It's also reported that Romanian prosecutors are conducting searches at the homes of people in the network of Horatiu Potra, the head of a mercenary band that provides protection for Călin Georgescu. Prosecutors found weapons and ammunition in a house inhabited by Potra and his son. They also found Also, prosecutors found about $1.5 million in a safe buried in the floor of Potra's house, as well as tickets to Moscow. So that has all been happening today. There will be people saying this was a setup and blah, 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 and that money was planted or whatever. I don't know, but he is a worry. He is definitely supported by Russia. And there was one poll that I saw that had him 40%, well ahead of Dan, the next candidate, who was something like 20-something%. So really quite far ahead. It's just a real worry. I think Russia are going to be heavily involved in this election, whether you like it or not. Now, speaking of which, let's go to Georgia. And we haven't heard much from Georgia, but they are still protesting. So this is the 90th day of non-stop nationwide protests demanding free elections and the release of political prisoners unlawfully jailed for defending Georgia's freedom, democracy and sovereignty. While the so-called government trolls count heads and dismiss the crowds as paid, every few decades, Georgians stand against Russian influence, occupation, hybrid terror, and efforts to strip them of their rights to choose their own geopolitical path, allies, governance style, and the way of life, says Katie Shosheshvili. I would love to interview a Georgian, actually, or someone with Georgian expertise to see exactly what's going on there still. I really do hope they are able to maintain this to effect a change. It is so sad what has happened there. And then we are going to look a little bit at Musk here. Just interesting to note that Europeans are fed up with Musk pouring Russian disinformation into Europe, says Jay in Kyiv, and Tesla sales now show it. So in January, European total electric car sales went up. And so you would expect Tesla sales to go up accordingly. But Tesla sales dropped. So that total electric car sales went up 35%. And Tesla sales dropped 45%. So that is very, that is a very big shift. But I also hope that this is a way to get Musk to start changing his ways. You hurt him in sales. You hurt him monetarily. I wonder whether there are going to be board members of Tesla wondering whether Musk is the right guy to be at the head of Tesla, if it's going to have long-term survivability. I know people have short memories and are very forgiving, but yeah, Tesla sales are being hit. Now, before we get on to the US in general, I'm going to go. I interviewed Caitlin. Please check out my live stream with Caitlin. It was superb. Caitlin Robertson is a delight to talk to, full of nuggets and personal experiences.
America died last night.
He lives in Kyiv at the moment. Check that live stream out. But he has given a short little, in the last 24 hours, a short little synopsis of what's going on from a Ukrainian point of view and how they are seeing what many are calling a betrayal by the United States. And this is his synopsis.
America died last night as a nation that was freedom-loving and pro-democracy when they voted against the United Nations motion put out that the invasion that happened in this country was illegal. They voted with Russia and North Korea for the first time. And that basically writes them off as any authority that believes anything to do with freedom. And at the exact same time, Macron, president of France, visits the White House, and Trump leaves him waiting for 2 hours, and then Macron has to sit next to him and correct his Kremlin lies over and over again.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total default.
There's a massive feeling right now that the US is embracing its own isolationism. And it reminds me of a movement that was set up back in the 1930s during World War II called America First.
It is now obvious that England is losing the war, that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send. That is why the America First Committee has been formed.
Lindbergh and the National America First Committee rail against any involvement in the war.
But the core principles of this was America first, no more help to Europe, we're not going to help Britain or France, we're only...
I'd never seen that Charles Lindbergh speech there before. I mean, I know about the movement and everything, but never heard that speech. I found that fascinating.
We're going to look after our own interests. Unfortunately, that group was disbanded after World War II. But if that group existed today, they would be at the front seat of the White House. They would be in the Oval Office, because it's exactly the principles of Trump and MAGA. And after pissing off Canada with the 51st state nonsense, after pissing off Mexico with the Gulf of Mexico nonsense, after banning critical media from the Oval Office, and after basically siding with the aggressor against the largest country in Europe, now Europe is fed up with the US. But there's also a feeling of hope here that I've never quite felt before. After 2 years in Ukraine and 2 years across the front lines, speaking to soldiers, to politicians everywhere in this country, there's a new sense of hope. And the leaders that gathered here across the EU are pledging support like they never have before. Trump is almost aligning Europe in a way that maybe hasn't happened since post-World War II. Maybe he might even have Britain like France. We'll see about that though. But there's a feeling that this country is going to win for the first time with or without the United States, and a feeling that actually Ukrainians don't have to hold onto every breath that comes out of the president of the US anymore, because Europe is actually going to step up for the first time.
And I thought that was a really interesting synopsis. Obviously, gives you a sense of what Ukrainians think about what's going on. And we have Timothy Milovanov talking about how Ukrainians see the US now. Here's a little snippet from CNN.
Oh, the mood is in Kyiv that we're being sold out. I personally disagree with that. I'm somewhat more optimistic, but I also was wrong 3 years ago when I thought Russia wouldn't invade. So the mood is, especially after yesterday's vote at the United Nations, the US didn't have to vote against the resolution. They could have simply abstained like China did. But they made a point, and they made a point of siding with Russia in everyone's face. So that sent chills through Kyiv, through Ukraine.
And yeah, that is something that has had a tremendous effect on the national psyche in Kyiv. Anyway, there's lots more there. There are lots of snippets from Milovanov on CNN. I won't go through all of them at the moment. We're going to go to the UK before actually going to the US, but I just thought we'd get a couple of Ukrainian views there, or views from Ukraine. In terms of the UK, just to have a little bit here, I love this from Keir Starmer. So I did a whole breaking news piece yesterday on Reform UK and how both the former Wales leader of Reform UK has been in court over pro-Russian bribes, but also Nigel Farage has been historically commenting favourably about Putin, but also regurgitating Russian talking points in NATO expansion being the cause of the war, and so on and so forth. So I was talking a lot about Reform yesterday as being, of all of the parties, more pro-Russia and less pro-Ukraine, to the point where none of the Reform UK politicians, all 5 of them, refuse to turn up for the 3rd-year anniversary Ukraine kind of debate and speeches in the House of Commons. Starmer was then questioned in this way by a GB News, which is very pro-reform, this new upstart that's supposed to be like the UK equivalent of Fox News. GB News pointed question.
In July, Reform UK fought the election on a policy to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and 3% of GDP after 2030, funded by a £6 billion saving in the aid budget. You said you'll do similar. You'll increase defence spending to 2.5% by 2027, 3% after 2030, funded by a £6 billion cut in the aid budget. Are you Nigel Farage in disguise?
Nigel Farage didn't even turn up to the debate in Parliament today. Nigel Farage is fawning over Putin. That's not patriotism. That is not what working people need. What I've done is take the duty of Prime Minister seriously, which is to ensure that our citizens are safe and secure, and this decision is made to ensure that they are safe and secure. It is a decision intended to ensure that we fight for the peace that we've enjoyed for the last 80 years, so that for generations to come they can enjoy the freedoms that we have enjoyed. So I've taken this with only one thing in mind, and that is the citizens of this country.
And that's a bit of a nice way to put him down. Lots of people are saying that's nice. Patriotism isn't fawning over Putin, and he's absolutely right there. Are you Nigel Farage in disguise? Nigel Farage didn't even turn up to debate in Parliament. Nigel Farage is fawning over Putin. That's not patriotism. Ouch. An inane question getting precisely the treatment it deserves. And yeah, here someone else saying, talking about that and delighting in that being a good put down. Now, it's worth noting that the statement is not the first time we've heard it. I think it was first heard here.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. National security is the first duty of any government, so I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement and his strong leadership today. The Honourable Member for Clacton has previously said that
that's Nigel Farage.
Putin is the leader he admires the most, and that it was NATO that provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While this government rises to the challenge of investing in our defence, does the Prime Minister share my concern that those comments play right into the hands of Britain's enemies? Prime Minister.
You don't show patriotism by fawning over Putin. Thank you.
I love that. That's all I've got to say is you don't show patriotism by fawning over Putin. And I'll sit back down. Thank you. Now, when there was the 3-year anniversary debates on Ukraine in the House of Commons, here is what SNP leader said about reform, Stephen Flynn.
A few of Putin's poodles who are not in their seats in this chamber here today. We are of course united in our support for the people of Ukraine, and indeed in wishing the Prime Minister well in his discussions with the President of the United States later this week. But I'm afraid that's where the unity ends, because whilst we support increasing defence spending, we cannot support the populist playbook of cutting foreign.
So a couple of things to note here. So first of all, he starts off talking about how Putin's poodles are not in the chamber today. Now, this is not actually the 3 year. This is him saying it yesterday, but reform weren't there again. Nigel Farage is probably, I don't know, licking Trump's feet in Mar-a-Lago or something. But he then goes on to criticise and say, yeah, we're unified in supporting increasing defence spending, but how you do it, we don't agree with taking that money from foreign aid. And I've discussed that in my military aid video, so I'm not going to discuss it here, but it will be controversial where that money comes from. And wherever you take it from, you're going to get criticisms, because it's got to come from somewhere. You can't invent that money out of nowhere. So if you take it from education, he would say the same thing. If you take it from NHS, he will say the same thing. It's a no-win situation for the government here, because they've got to increase defence spending, but it's a zero-sum game. So that will necessarily mean there's a decrease in funding from elsewhere. Now, interesting that Zelensky is planning to visit London after Washington, saying, if I go to the US, I plan to visit London next. And immediately after that, we'll meet with Europeans, including Keir Starmer. So that is fantastic news there. It looks like Keir Starmer is playing himself into quite an important position in Europe, right, as a kind of non-EU leader. And I think that bodes well for him, for the government, for the UK, and for hopefully a closer relationship with Europe. Now, I've got a message here from Jeff Vida, who said, look, I try my best to enjoy your shows about just about every morning, but your constant raging and ranting about the US is becoming a drag. As you would say, sorry, not sorry. and I understand that. Like, if you are American, and if you are an American Republican, and if you're an American Republican Trump voter and Trump supporter, it's quite difficult because I just rage about Trump all the time. But it's really difficult because he's saying stuff all the time that is rage-inducing. And I don't know how I get away with this. Like, if you were a fan of Putin, like, you could come to me and say, oh, can you stop slagging off Putin? Well, not really, because he's a genocidal dictator. And so I'm going to take him to task. And that's what this was all about. And if you have a Western leader who has gone from being a supporter of, well, that's not correct. I don't think he's ever a supporter of Ukraine. If you've gone from a country being supportive of Ukraine, and I was pretty supportive of the Biden administration, though criticizing it in places where they demanded criticism, they deserved criticism. The problem is Trump has come along and he's not good for Ukraine. He is trying to get stuff out of Ukraine for his own personal benefit, and then he's doing all sorts of crazy things that are dictatorial and autocratic and authoritarian within his own government. So it's really difficult for me not to comment on that. Like, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and go, oh, that's really good. I love how Trump has just changed the way that the press pool is selected, or the, you know, and there's now going to be authoritarian diktats from the White House press secretary as to who gets to be in the White House press pool, etc., etc. I'm not going to go, oh, that's brilliant, well done, that's really freedom of press, isn't it? No, it's authoritarian, and that then breeds a sense of the White House being able to do and say what it likes without any checks and balances, which is as authoritarian as we see over in the Kremlin and Russia. So I'm not going to not criticize Trump because he is worthy of criticism, and it's that simple. And it is so very much to do with the future of Ukraine, to the point where Zelensky has admitted that today, and we're going to get to that. But he's like, we can't do this without the US. So whatever the US does and says, I am going to be analysing, and unfortunately, most of it deserves criticism at the moment. That's just the way it is. Sorry, not sorry. But thanks, Jeff, for watching. Okay, I've done the breaking news update about the minerals deal, and it does look like, I'm speculating somewhat here, but it does look like Zelensky has been able to turn that around from a really, really, really bad deal that is extorting $500 billion out of Ukraine to perhaps a cooperative deal that is a positive sum game. Now, that is great. You know, they've taken out the $500 billion figure. The wording on 100% financial interest for the US is gone. Existing Ukraine mineral extraction is excluded from the scope, which is very important, notably existing oil and gas production by Uknafta and Nafta Gas. In other words, the gas and oil that they're taking out of the ground, and I don't know if that's, and mineral extraction that is already taking place, is not under the jurisdiction of this agreement. And actually, that's good. So it's like, you're not helping ourselves to stuff we've already got and is making money for us. But actually, you're going to come on board with us to see about future extraction. And interestingly, that includes in areas of occupied territory where the Russians are in control at the moment. And that gives the US an impetus to help liberate those areas, unless, of course, they go and do a deal with Russia, and we'll come on to that. But, you know, it is potentially a really significant turnaround here. Now, Trump has announced that he reckons it's valued, the rare earth metals could be valued at $1 trillion. There are other analyses to suggest that actually it's far, far less, certainly in terms of rare earth metals. And that's why you've seen, you know, oil and gas be added to this. Now, Zelensky on a potential meeting with Trump to discuss this, quote, if we don't have this, nothing will work. I need to understand what will happen to us, to our families tomorrow, and where you, the US, stand. We don't just need agreements on money. We're trying to survive. My first question, will you stop military aid? absolutely on point there, and I could play you him saying exactly that. So this is, this is an existential thing for us, but we absolutely need this. But what's most important is that you do not stop military aid to us. We're grateful to the United States, but it was a grant. If they continue to tell us that they will give money only on credit, this will be a new reality. So previously we've got grants, and if it's dictated to us that we can't get help, that help will now just come on credit, then I guess they're saying essentially there's not a lot we can do about that. I won't go even for 10 cents of debt repayment in the agreement with the US. And that's pretty important. In fact, there's a few things. Let's see if there was one statement that he said, I wanted it, and it ended up being 0.10, that there had to be security guarantees. The visit was proposed to us. Yeah, I have an important issue. I really want this visit. So he's going to go to the US. There's no 500 billion, 350 billion, 100 billion debt in the agreement. It would be unfair. The fund issue is also resolved. I see partners there. This deal can be a great success or pass quietly. Great success depends on the conversation with Trump. Today's military meeting was crucial due to many challenges. Key topics: air defense systems, drones, electronic warfare, missiles, and domestic production. We analysed deep strikes, drone production, air defense, shortages, and global partnerships. We have a clear roadmap, and I'm satisfied. So that's on like how the war's going, etc., etc. He's also there's been talk about, look, if a deal isn't done with the US, then the most important thing is you need to reconstitute your armed forces, and that's why this 18 to 24-year-old new kind of contract thing is so important. They're hoping to get sort of 4,000 applications a month on that, and that would help to reconstitute the army. I will preserve the quantitative composition of the army as much as possible, because this is the best guarantee of security, and that speaks to exactly that. I'm sure, Ukraine and US finalise a minerals agreement, revenues from resources, while the US ensures financial support. The deal ties into security guarantees and EU accession. I'm going to find that one particular quote I was thinking about. Yeah, here it is. I really wanted at least the sentence, quote, guarantees of Ukraine's security to appear in a framework agreement. And the fact that I was briefed by government officials, it appeared in point 10. It is important that it is there. The agreement can be a great success or pass quietly. So yeah, that's the one I was talking about. So hopefully there will be these security agreements in the final text. On kind of oil and gas and natural resources, and the fact that they have had their own gas infrastructure massively hit over the last month. Ukraine's DZYGA'S, that's a private company, plans LNG, liquefied natural gas import, an import deal by April, according to Bloomberg, expecting to finalise and announce a deal within the next 2 months with potential partners based in the US. So that'll please Trump, getting exports up of LNG directly to Ukraine. Now, Putin has offered Trump, very cleverly I think, a minerals deal of his own from occupied territories of Ukraine. So that then undercuts the US impetus to make sure that territory is liberated. Right, so Putin's declared his readiness to cooperate with the US and provide them with the profitable access to minerals in northern Russia, the Caucasus, the Far East, and the occupied Donbass. This is a massive move by Putin. Putin offered joint production of aluminium, promising the Americans good profits and 2 million tons of metal in their market. And indeed, Russia's government is reportedly ready to supply the US with 650 million tons of rare earth metals. According to Russian media, this information is still unconfirmed. Here's my analogy. This is how it goes. Ivan beats up Doris. Doris on the other side of the road absolutely beats the crap out of Doris. You're there going, this is terrible. You can't beat her up. This is awful. And then sort of Brad goes over, yeah, it's awful. Here's a baseball bat, gives Doris a baseball bat. And then halfway through he goes, hang on, Doris, can I have some money for that baseball bat I've given you? Yeah, but you gave it to me. I'm using it to beat off Ivan. Yeah, says Brad. Yeah, man, but I want money for that. Anyway, that's all problematic. And then Ivan goes, I'll tell you what, mate, how about me and you, we do a deal, and if you help me out here, which will, help me gain power over Doris and over other people, get me to a position where I'm a thug, but you accept me because we have a deal. How about you come to my house and we can do some deals on some of these drugs I've got, or not something dodgy like that. Maybe potatoes. I grow a lot of potatoes in my back garden, says Ivan. We can do a deal on that and we can make you some money. So Brad's gone from supporting Doris while she's getting beaten up by Ivan to doing a deal with Ivan, who is at the moment continuing to beat up Doris. And Brad is going, hey, yeah, no, actually, hang on, stop screaming, Doris. Shh. I'm trying to do a deal with Ivan here. Meanwhile, Ivan's like, oh yeah, yeah, Doris, yeah. So, Brad, you want to have my potatoes? You can have half of my potatoes. It's just ridiculous that we'd be entertaining. I mean, hopefully the US don't, but if the US enter into negotiations to do a deal, and you can bet those dollar signs are flashing in Trump's eyes, then morality means nothing. Long-term strategizing about the power in the world means nothing. But of course, the power in the world then becomes an empire that is a conjoined empire of the US and Russia. And the growing authoritarian characteristics of the US will then start aligning with that of Russia, and you get an authoritarian cooperative, if you like, where instead of the US pulling Russia into its orbit of democracy, Russia is pulling the US into its orbit of autocracy. And yeah, it's a real worrying sign. But of course, it depends what the US says about that. Now, Christopher Miller says, in all, the US has spent just 0.19% of their GDP on military assistance for Ukraine. And that's if you accept those figures that have been highly challenged, as you will see in my military aid video. This is trivial, particularly in comparison to the cost of its previous wars. In return, it has gained the humiliation of what was once thought to be a powerful enemy, and a vindication of the ideals of liberal democracy, for which Ukrainians are fighting, and the US once fought. That is coming from a Financial Times opinion piece. The US is now the enemy of the West, is the Financial Times piece. Again, I'm trying not to just sit here and slag off the US, but these are the editorials being written and the opinion pieces being written in very established, pretty centrist newspapers, well, Financial Times centre-right newspapers that show that the world is aghast at what Donald Trump has done over the last month or so. Timothy Snyder, historian of Ukraine, says it should be astonishing, though it's not, that the American negotiators want to bring from the premise that Russia was right and that Ukraine is not sovereign. So this is going back to the UN resolution, everyone failing to admit in the Trump administration that Russia are the aggressor, calling Zelensky the dictator. Trump was called out on that yesterday, or was it the day before now? And he refused. He said, they said, would you call Putin a dictator? He said, I don't use that term lightly, and then refused to call Putin a dictator whilst having called Zelensky a dictator. I don't use it lightly, but Zelensky's a dictator. So we've got this real switcheroo, to which Timothy Snyder says, the American negotiators want to begin from a premise that Russia was right and that Ukraine is not sovereign. Accepting the lies of the aggressor isn't just unethical, it's also unstrategic. Agreeing with Russia that a war of aggression leads to the end of Ukrainian sovereignty is not just morally but factually wrong. It's a complete misreading of what happened these last 3 years as Ukrainians won battles, took back territory, and proved their existence by any conceivable metric. Any peace will have to begin from legal and political reality. For America, at this point in the war, to help Russia undo Ukrainian sovereignty is not just injustice, but a provocation to a much broader war. Now, the Institute for the Study of War says US Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, referred to the early 2022 Istanbul Protocols as offering guideposts for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. An agreement based on those protocols would be a capitulation document. We're going to talk about Steve Witkoff in a minute, but this is really important. The Istanbul Protocols emerged from Russia-Ukraine negotiations in March and April 2022 as Ukraine was still reeling from the initial Russian invasion and do not reflect the situation today. The draft agreement included the following key provisions that would destroy Ukraine's ability to defend itself and prohibit any state from helping Ukraine do so. Ukraine would have to amend its constitution to remove the clause committing Ukraine to NATO membership, add Ukraine's commitment to permanent neutrality, and make Russian an official language of Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces were to be capped at 85,000 and restricted to 342 tanks, 519 artillery pieces and missiles with ranges under 40 kilometers. The provision of Ukraine of any foreign weapons, including missiles of any type, armed forces and formations, was to be banned. The US, UK, China, France and Russia were to guarantee Ukraine's neutrality, but all parties were to have to agree on a response to any violation, giving Russia a veto over any action. The guarantors were to commit to ending permanently all bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, including those regarding the provision of military aid. And these demands, which Putin has often reiterated, amount to complete Ukrainian capitulation, not a sustainable peace in the interests of the US and Europe, to say nothing of Ukraine. Witkoff also stated that deals only work when they're good for all the parties. That's a pathway we're on here. Istanbul cannot be the basis for such agreement. So if you ever hear the mention of the Istanbul agreement, you know it's bad news for Ukraine. And we're going to go to Witkoff just after this Kyiv Independent piece that says, in talks with Russia, Trump repeats his Afghanistan playbook. It's really important to look for historical form to get an idea of what's going on in the heads of those big players. And a big player here is Trump and his team. Now, Trump previously, lots of people slag off Biden for the botched Afghanistan withdrawal. But the thing about that was, and the defense that the Biden administration give, and there's a lot to this, is that they were just adhering to the Doha Agreement. And the Doha Agreement was put in place before Biden came to power. And it was Trump's agreement that went over the head of the Kabul administration and went straight to the Taliban and did this deal that the Taliban then ended up breaking anyway. In other words, if you go over the head of Ukraine to Putin and his terroristic organization, he will only break those rules just as the Taliban did. And that's also not good for Ukraine. And there are really strong parallels. And Kyiv Independent's got an excellent article on this. I'd love to read it all to you, but don't have time. The idea that Kabul got sidelined just as Kyiv is getting sidelined is exactly what happened previously. And then this piece on Trump's attitude to negotiations. In February 2020, during his previous presidency, Trump's previous presidency, the Taliban signed a deal with the United States in Doha, Qatar. The US promised to withdraw its troops within 14 months. So it had to be done within 14 months. That's why it was done in that time frame, and signaled it would lift economic sanctions while the Taliban agreed to not attack US troops, eventually opened talks with the Afghan government, and to prevent terrorist groups from operating in Taliban-controlled territory. The deal signed in Doha had secret agreements that were not publicized, leaving Afghan President Ashraf Ghani confused about exactly what the US president had promised his foe. So US government, Trump had gone over the head of Kabul, gone to the Taliban, actually had offered the Taliban to come to Camp David, done a deal that was secret with the Taliban and that the Afghani government didn't even know about. It's just incredible. Meanwhile, the Taliban violated its pledges almost immediately, escalated violent attacks and maintained ties with terrorist groups. Rather than holding the Taliban accountable, the Trump administration continued with its pledge to withdraw troops. Quote, it's very easy to say the two wars are not similar. Of course, it's very easy to draw distinctions. But in terms of the general behaviour of Trump towards negotiations, I think it's very instructive, said an expert, Willsey. All Trump wanted was to say, I got out of Afghanistan. The details didn't really matter, said Willsey, calling his negotiation tactics a complete disaster. And other people, including an author on Trump, said Trump is a bad negotiator. People think he's a good negotiator. He's bad. He's been bankrupted 6 times. Different ones of different organisations were bankrupt 6 times. When he went on NBC's The Apprentice, they developed him into this false sense of who he really was, that he was this great business leader, but he never really has been that. He's a wheeler deal. He's more like a mafia boss, and he's not a great negotiator. And a lot of people have said he's not a good negotiator. So, quote, "We've got such short-term memories. It was only 4 years ago, but we should have remembered how this man operates," he added. "It's a bit of a condemnation of all of us that we weren't really ready." The idea that I just want to get out of Afghanistan is I just want peace. I just want this war to stop in Ukraine. And that's the same approach. Anyway, there's lots more detail in this article, very worth reading. Let's now go to one of the people he's put in charge of negotiations, who is, I think, wholly underqualified and is basically a billionaire mate. Right, Olena Wave does a quite long thread on Steve Witkoff. "It's becoming increasingly clear that Special Representative Steve Witkoff is more dangerous than Musk, Trump Jr., Vance, or anyone else." Okay, we have already discussed his direct business ties with Dmitriev, the head of the Moscow Direct Investment Fund. It was by the way, who was there at the negotiations, so they've already done business together. Compromise much? Conflict of interest much? It was Dmitriev who was the informal head of the Moscow delegation in Saudi Arabia. It seems that it was Dmitriev who was on the government plane to Washington before Witkoff's visit to Moscow. It was Dmitriev who has New York and Saudi business contacts and connections with Peter Thiel, and Witkoff. And it seems that it was Dmitriev who suggested to Trump the idea of demanding compensation of $300 billion from Ukraine, with the USA allegedly lost due to the exit from the Moscow market, twisting the initial talks between the USA and Ukraine. Dmitriev himself told the Moscow Interfax about this, that he gave the American side data on the losses of Americans in the Moscow market due to sanctions to support Ukraine. This is the eternal Moscow narrative. I mean, this is brilliant from the Russians. The Russians are playing the US. The Russians, when you got Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio, these real noobs, and even Mike Waltz to some degree, up against Sergei Lavrov, Dmitriev, and the other chap, I forget his name, beginning with R. These guys are seasoned veterans. Lavrov's been doing this for decades, and they know what they're doing. And prior to the negotiations, they're like, "Oh, do you know how much money you've lost because of this war in the stock markets in Moscow and blah blah blah? Here it is, and here's this, and here's that," and just priming the US towards finding in their favour. Quote, "The West is hurt more than Russia by sanctions," a narrative that Witkoff received from Dmitriev and Witkoff brought to Trump's ears. So Trump's then getting this information directly from the Kremlin through the middleman, Witkoff. As of yesterday, Dmitriev was appointed Putin's special representative on economic and investment issues for communication with Western countries. The purpose of the appointment is a cancellation of sanctions and a return of Western businesses. In general, the communication link looks as follows: Putin to Dmitriev to Witkoff to Trump. Do you know why this amount is equivalent? That's right, the amount of frozen Moscow assets, which are mostly where in Europe, and to which neither the USA nor Moscow de facto have access, but are going to use them for the appearance of concessions. What was the last news for these 300 frozen billion? That allegedly Moscow is ready to give them up in order to restore Ukraine and the occupied territories. So we have heard rumours that they're willing to say you can keep those $300 billion of frozen assets as long as one of the stipulations was as long as a proportion of that is invested into the occupied territories of Ukraine. That allegedly Moscow is ready to give them up in order to restore Ukraine and the occupied territories. Do you know what this news prevents? Process in Europe for additional use of frozen assets, other options and programs for military support of Ukraine and the expense of these assets. What does Witkoff do? Legitimize this opinion. Quote, "You will see concessions from both sides." Then he continued, "Someone will have to give in territorially and someone will have to give in economically." In other words, Russia are going to be happy to swap occupied territories for $300 billion of frozen Russian assets, but you won't be able to use them militarily, and you had to invest some of them in occupied territories. Obviously, territorially, we're talking about Ukraine, and economically, we're talking about $300 billion of frozen Russian assets that Moscow is allegedly ready to give up. But in fact, both territorially and economically, Ukraine must concede, because neither the USA nor Moscow will ultimately concede anything. That's not a concession. That's already been frozen by Europe. That is like, you ain't getting that back. That's not a concession. But the US sees this as a concession. So we have a situation where the USA is trying to get the equivalence of $300 billion from Ukraine through the treaty. And that's why that was part of the, that's sort of subsumed within the number $350 or $500 billion, which Moscow financiers pitched to Trump through Witkoff as an idea, twisting the original idea that Lindsey Graham was developing. The distortion now looks like this. The US seems to give Europe a check for its expenses, an agreement on frozen Russian assets, but in fact the US wants to compensate for everything at the expense of Ukraine. As a result, Ukraine must cede to the USA funds, cede to the Moscow territories and everything else. And in fact, this is a rather cunning, elaborate and professional trap where Witkoff and Dmitriev tried to share the benefits of the war using separate agreements. Talks about Russia's rare earth resources for the USA from Putin's latest statement are an element of pressure on Ukraine. Buy now because it will be too late and the Russians will buy. In fact, as long as there are ties with China, no one in Russia will allow the USA to access resources. The idea about Russian resources was once again legalized first by Witkoff and then interested Trump, with a high probability of providing a track from Putin's side by prior agreement with Dmitriev. Yesterday, Witkoff began to legalize the opinion that Russia is a provoked party. After Witkoff gets an agreement, that is, they determine who will pay the benefits for the US to sell as a victory, Witkoff and Dmitriev will move to the second stage, the territorial one. Meanwhile, Trump directly says that he perceives this agreement as a return of funds, not an investment in Ukraine. I think everyone has heard the answer to the question about investments in Ukraine. The way out of the situation is to demonstrate Witkoff's involvement through the Western media in order to increase pressure on him, and at least in Europe, to delegitimize his very persona as a negotiator. The material was prepared by the Ukrainian analytical channel DZYGA'S. I apologize for the shortcomings of the automatic translation. Okay, etc., etc. So, interesting that could be what's going on. Now, the minerals deal has changed a lot, but that certainly appears to be what was going on underneath it all, under the bonnet, really, in terms of the initial US position on that minerals deal. And it seems like all the concessions are going to come essentially from Europe and Ukraine. It's like, you're going to concede that $300 billion. That's going to be used for reconstruction. The war stops. They keep the occupied territories. The US gets a deal on rare earth minerals, etc., and oil and gas. And the US gets to do a deal with Russia in terms of their resources. Happy days. And the US comes out all like quids in. Brilliant war. It's made us loads of money. Thank you very much. And meanwhile, Ukraine is screwed over and Europe don't get a look in. Meanwhile, Trump is pimping his hats. Now, that's not what this video, why I'm showing you part of this video, although I find it really distasteful that that's what he's doing. I'm now going to just do a little bit on what you hear the guy, one of his advisors here, who he keeps referring to, say.
Ryan, you're not a stiff. You're sort of a stiff guy. He'll take other things, but not a free hand.
Always say yes to the president. Always say yes to the president.
Would anybody like one?
Always say yes to the president. I would never say that in public. You know, you said it. Oh, you always say yes to the Prime Minister, eh, PM? You said it in private as a gag, a kind of almost self-deprecating gag. But to say that in public is an indication that you are treating this guy. None of us can say, you've always got to say yes to the president. Ha ha ha. No, that's not funny, because you are admitting, like even in jest, like almost like in vino veritas, like in wine there is truth. When you're drunk, you accidentally give out the truth. Well, actually in jest, there is a lot of truth. And the truth here is that everyone always says yes to the president around it. There is no pushback. I find that fascinating. So always saying yes to the president, never criticising the president, it goes to what has happened in the White House. And I referenced this earlier. So this is the White House press secretary.
Today's journalists, the White House Correspondents Association, has long dictated which journalists get to ask questions of the President of the United States in these most intimate spaces.
Not dictated, they've chosen. It's a free press. They get to choose the press pool.
Not anymore. I am proud to announce that we are going to give the power back to the people who read your papers, who watch your television shows, and who listen to your radio stations. Moving forward, the White House press pool will be determined by the White House press team.
Right. Yeah, we're going to give it back to the people. That sounds really good. How are you going to give it back to the people? Are they going to get to decide who's in the press pool? So we're going to give it back to the people. And from now on, it's going to be decided by the White House press team. Me. I'm going to decide who gets to ask the questions. And anyone that asks difficult questions, bye, because we live in an autocracy. So when Jeff Eder says, you're raging and ranting about the US, blah, blah, blah. What do we say about this? Like, Jeff, what do you say about this? Is this a good move? Is this going to get... So when there are really horrendous decisions about Ukraine, potentially, that the US president makes, how do we get to challenge him if the White House press pool is decided by the White House press team?
Legacy outlets who have participated in the press pool for decades will still be allowed to join. Fear not. But we will also be offering the privilege to well-deserving outlets who have never been allowed to share in this awesome responsibility. Just like we added a new media seat in this briefing room, legacy media outlets who have DC-based...
So what they're doing is they're taking in people like OEN, Newsmax, Breitbart, Daily Caller, and smaller, more rabid and obsequious yes men, right? And they're saying, and we're going to dilute you all. And when it comes to questions, I might not ask you guys. Don't worry, we're not going to kick you out. But we are going to elevate these guys just as we have done already. And that was something I announced previously, that they'd made this seat for some of their yes men. It's just, this is what a growing dictatorship looks like. In fact, it gets even worse. A coterie of Trump loyalists, according to NBC, is in the early phase of a campaign to rewrite the Constitution so that Trump can serve another term. We know that there's a formal group that was at CPAC that was representing them. These guys, the Third Term Project. Constitution is clear on that point. He's not under the 22nd Amendment. No one may be elected president more than twice, and that rules out Trump. But some people are saying, well, they weren't contiguous. Is that a way of getting him in? And then, rewriting the Constitution, and we'll see. The military, the Pentagon is set for a shake-up. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. It's just, it looks rather bad when you've purged the CIA, purged the FBI, purged the top brass at the military, and then got rid of military attorneys general, so that there's no legal comeback here, it looks. So the Pentagon is set for a shake-up. They failed in 7 audits, true, in a row. Trust in the military is low among service members. The president will shake up the Pentagon. So it's going to get a big shake-up, but when you've got rid of the checks and balances, that shake-up happens in exactly the way they want it to happen. And yeah, when I talk about how... I've talked previously how there's a memo out there. You're not allowed to call Putin a dictator, and you're not allowed to call the Russians an aggressor. And this is really, really sad that the present US government is just kowtowing to the Kremlin.
Mr. Feinberg, did Russia invade Ukraine?
Well, going to my behind closed doors statement a second ago, I'll just say this.
He can't even say that Russia invaded Ukraine.
They moved tanks and troops and armored personnel carriers across the Ukrainian border. It's a pretty simple question.
Yeah. Well, here's how, if I may, I'd like to
If
say,
you would ask the chairman of this committee if Russia invaded Ukraine, I'm pretty sure, the Republican chairman, I'm pretty sure I would know the answer. Mr. Feinberg.
If you don't find that disturbing, if you don't find it disturbing that the Deputy Secretary of Defense cannot answer the question, did Russia invade Ukraine. We have a reality problem here. There's just an alternative reality. And again, I would say to Jeff Feeder, thanks for watching, but how would you, like, do I not report this? Because it's making the US look bad? I mean, it is making the US look bad. It's terrible. I can't not rage about it. It's like ignoring the tidal wave that's coming towards you. Do you know what? I might acknowledge that and go, we might need to get out of the way, guys. Just, it's insane. Do you answer? Are we orbiting the sun? Well, I don't know. Well, I would like. Yeah, are we orbiting the sun? Literally, are we orbiting the sun? But you know, I mean, it depends on. Oh, yeah, that's tough. No, it's not. We're orbiting the sun. Did Russia invade Ukraine? Yes, they frickin' did, mate. They did. Do you know what? I can show it on video. Ugh. Luckily, there is a bipartisan group of the House of Representatives that has expressed support for Ukraine. In a joint statement, lawmakers stressed that Putin must not succeed and Russia must face a decisive strategic defeat. So there is still bipartisan support. 2 Republican congressmen with guts is all it takes to change everything. So yeah, 215 to 217. It's going to be interesting to see if that advantage holds. Now, I was talking to JP Lindsley about this in Kiev, where we had many wines together, and the guys who drove the trucks out with me will know he was there. He's a large in life character, former Fox News person. I would describe him as anti-MAGA, but actually really secretly MAGA himself. But he's so pro-Ukraine that he understands that there's a tension there. So he does definitely sit on the right and favour the right. And his campaign at the moment, if you call it that, his project at the moment is to try and understand MAGA voters, to try and get them to reject this idea that Ukraine are the bad guys. How do we unlock that? And this is really good. This is absolutely right. It needs to be done. Here are 8 key MAGA objections to Ukraine. You realise it's not Ukraine they oppose, it's Washington. Address these objections and you'll cut through the noise, revealing that Ukrainians and Americans could be the best of allies. This is well worth doing and almost worthy of a separate video. Objection number 1, we voted against foreign wars. We're done with the war machine. Reply, those who profit from endless war are precisely the people who are stopping Ukraine from winning. Objection 2, where's all the money gone? It's costing America too much. Reply, America is actually profiting 2023 and 2024 record years for the US defense industry foreign sales. And if Doge would pay attention, they'd see Ukraine is the proving ground for the decentralization of warfare that could make the Pentagon a hell of a lot more efficient. Objection 3, remember that when Biden gave $8 billion to Ukraine while Americans were suffering from hurricanes? We're just tired of this shit. We feel we're being fooled. Reply, we were all fooled. It often seemed Biden was trying to make Americans tired of Ukraine. That $8 billion during the hurricanes, it wasn't new money. It's part of $60 billion Congress had allocated in April. Biden was just slow, and most of it wasn't cash. It was a valuation of old gear given to Ukraine. Objection 4, Ukraine is corrupt. Why support it? Reply, the Global Corruption Perception Index is just that, perception. Ukrainians talk a lot about corruption because since their 2014 Revolution of Dignity, they've been doing what MAGA sets out to do now, reset communist-minded institutions to zero and make something more honest. Russia, seeking to plunder, wants to keep the corruption that Ukrainians hate. Objection number 5, Ukraine has been the weapon to attack Trump since the first impeachment. So, why do we trust you? Reply, the Democrats used Ukraine to attack Trump, and Russians gleefully used this to make sure MAGA hated Ukraine. The famous 2019 Zelensky-Trump call, look at it closely. Someone did not want Trump and Zelensky, the USA and Ukraine, to work together because they were agreeing on a lot of things, from Biden boondoggles to Merkel's mischief. Objection number 6, we gave you a lot for 3 years and you couldn't finish the job. Time's up. Reply, it was Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan who continually restricted Ukraine from winning. Each time Ukraine was in a position to pounce, each time Russia was weakened, Biden tightened the clause on Ukraine. It's a Biden administration lie that the USA gave Ukraine a lot these past 3 years. 21 examples of how Biden effed over Ukraine. That's another thread from JP Lindsay. So you get where he's coming from. You can disagree with some of these points, but he's trying to get in the mind of the MAGAs. Number 7. Come on, Ukraine's 2014 revolution was created by Victoria Nuland and the State Department. Really? Is the reply. A State Department bureaucrat passing out cookies really created a revolution that transformed a nation from Soviet mindset to innovative freedom. Nuland also brought back the Ukrainian language. This is like accusing the Russians of creating MAGA. Look closely and you see that Nuland, at the behest of Obama, Biden, was trying to mitigate the revolution. And actually, there's lots of evidence who suggests he was trying to put it down. Objection number 8, Burisma. Reply. This objection is often simply expressed in one word. It represents the notion that Biden supported Ukraine because his son made money from Burisma. But if you look closely, you'll see the inverse. Biden prevented Ukraine from winning, even as his son took money from Burisma, a pro-Kremlin firm that opposed Ukraine's independence. And that's how he would answer those issues. JD Vance has come out and really annoyed people by, at the end of a screed, saying, I always found it offensive that a new immigrant to our country would be willing to use the power and influence of their new nation to settle the ethnic rivalries of old. Talking about Ukrainian there, Ukrainian American. So he's just dismissing the war as an ethnic rivalry of old. The so-called ethnic rivalry entails dozens of towns and villages being razed to the ground, people under occupation being executed for being Ukrainian and buried in mass graves. Tens of thousands of children have been kidnapped, rape and torture are used as weapons of war. Everything is looted down to the bare walls. Entire ecosystems are being destroyed, and so much more devastation is inflicted by Russia upon a country that is only guilty of existing next to Russia, says Kate from Kharkiv. JD Vance just referred to the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an ethnic rivalry. And Michael Weiss, the journalist, saying ethnic rivalries, he knows absolutely nothing about this war and is quite self-satisfied in his ignorance and incuriosity. Also note the implicit agreement with the Ukrainian American interlocutor that his position was indeed to abandon Ukraine. I didn't read the rest of that, but you can go and check that out. Now, Trump, aside from all of this, has now touted this new idea called the gold card, which is if you give $5 million. If you buy a $5 million gold card, then you get citizenship in the US. Trump says Russian oligarchs could be eligible for $5 million gold card, US gold card. I know some Russian oligarchs that are very nice people, Trump said. Just pretty incredible, isn't it? This is oligarchy.
Be eligible for a gold card?
Yeah, possibly. Hey, I know some Russian oligarchs that are very nice people. It's possible.
Says his advisor, laughs his advisor. That's really funny. He knows some nice Russian oligarchs. He does literally know Russian oligarchs that he sees as nice because they've got a lot of money and he's compromised by them. I speculate.
They're not quite as wealthy as they used to be. They're not as wealthy as they used to be.
Actually, they are. Some of them have profited handsomely from the war.
I think they can afford. I think they can afford $5 million. So no, a lot of people are going to want to. A lot of people are going to want to be in this country, and they'll be able to work and provide jobs and build companies and pay taxes. All of those things. It's an incredible. It's an incredible thing. I mean, this is the group that is the first to hear it. Nobody's heard about it. Nobody.
You can buy your way into the US. You don't need to work hard, just have a bunch of money. Whereas those hard-working immigrants have come in. Deport the people who work hard for a living, says Anne Applebaum, import international criminals. So I just thought I'd throw that one in there. Now, talking about where the US is at and the kind of extortion and the deals that seem to be going on. There's an interesting piece in the New York Times and there's a quote from it: experts cannot recall precedent for the United States or any other country extracting cash or resources from its own allies during a time of war. Yeah, fascinating. And of course, while that deal has somewhat changed, it still started out as a massive extortion. Edward Hunter Christie says, logically, as the Trump administration is Russia friendly, its associates are also friendly towards Serbia and towards the Serbian Republic within Bosnia and Herzegovina. One should fully expect what Rudy Giuliani prepared with and will report back to the White House regarding his trip. We have Rudy Giuliani with lots of MAGA hats on Serbian TV, hobnobbing with the Serbs, and there you go. The Trump camp has had a habit of bulldozing through complex Balkan issues with little regard to their immense sensitivity. Today, Rudy Giuliani is in Bosnia interviewing Putin-loving nationalist politician Milorad Dodik, just ahead of a verdict that could sideline him from politics for a decade. That's who Rudy Giuliani's hanging out with. Actually, I said Serbia, that's in Bosnia there. But yeah, this is the kind of sentiment that I like to hear. This is good old Bernie Sanders.
I do not want to hear one Republican come to the floor of the Senate and talk about freedom unless that senator has the guts to call out Trump for the lies that he is telling about Putin and the war in Ukraine.
Jeff, mate, I will be singing the freaking praises of the United States every day of the week if all your politicians were coming out and saying this. It's not the US that's the problem. It's those MAGA politicians and a Trump administration. That's the problem. It's quite easy to be lauded. All you need to do is be morally upstanding and say the right things.
Mr. President, it was Russia that started the war, not Ukraine. It is Putin who is the dictator, not Zelensky. This country must not align itself with Putin and authoritarianism. We must fight for democracy all over the world.
Yes, 100%. Bernie Sanders, total legend. That's the America I want to hear. And Rory Stewart, conservative politician, or former conservative politician, says, is there anything that Trump has done in the last 40 days inside the US or with Canada and Germany to Ukraine that is not exactly what Putin wanted? Could the Russian intelligence services have ever dreamt of a more perfect candidate and policies to serve Russia's interests? I mean, answer me that. Jeff, I mean, answer me. Because it's looking like everything he's doing is to the benefit either directly of himself or of Putin, or both. And then we heard that Peter Navarro, one of the US president's closest advisors, is pushing for the US to remove Canada from the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network, which also includes the UK, Australia and New Zealand. I reported that yesterday. Michael White said picking fights with allies who have fought and died on our behalf and rewarding revanchist dictatorships a true idiocracy deserving of isolation and defiance. Now, Peter Navarro has come out and denied this. But the guy that wrote the article, I believe, has come out and said, I 100% stand behind the article because he had a chance to deny this before the article came out, and he didn't. And only when there's all this backlash has he come out and denied it. So make of that what you will. But it doesn't surprise me because we're hearing all sorts of stuff on Canada still. Now, the USA gets 60% of its aluminium from Canada, tariff-free, close, secure source. Trump is now threatening to put tariffs on Canada as a national security threat, but then talking about getting the aluminium from Russia instead. Just as he's tariffs on potash, national security threat, put tariffs on Canada for potash and get the potash from Belarus, where we've lifted sanctions on potash. Because nothing says national security threat like your kind neighbours Canada and lifting sanctions on Russia and Belarus. Again, like, how do I not report on this? As Flavio Volpe says, literally the bad guys. Are Americans okay with Russian aluminium fighter jets and F-150s, big Ford pickups? Make it out of Russian aluminium, but not Canadian aluminium. Now, there was as Ed Manzini says, good morning from Canada. Watched a Liberal leadership debate to replace Trudeau last night. So that's going to be Freeland, Chrystia Freeland, Mark Carney. I don't know if there's anyone else. All the candidates were very good. All agreed to increase our defence spending to 2%, long overdue, due to the threat of the USA, which is a first. They also agreed to become closer to allies with like-minded democratic countries in Europe and the Far East. We will pivot away from the USA and fight back financially to remain a sovereign nation. I'm concerned because on the news, I watched a meeting in the Oval Office and one of the men advised Trump to have the province of Alberta separate. Now, this is important because Alberta has, what's her name? Female leader there. There's quite a lot of devolved power in Canada. So it's not that centralized. Different provinces have different flavors, but they all have a lot of political clout and power. And because the province of Alberta is so MAGA, like the ruler there is, what's her name? Is it Smith? anyway, she's so MAGA that the US are thinking we could peel away Alberta. So he's saying, Manzini's saying, I watched a meeting in the Oval Office and one of the men advised Trump to have the province of Alberta separate and join the USA, and then other Western provinces will follow. Divide and conquer. It's a possibility as Alberta has a conservative anti-federal government. Yeah, it's really very MAGA-esque, the government in Alberta, from what I can gather. I have watched videos on that because that's how cool I am. Yeah, that's a real worry, actually, if they peel away one province. Yeah. So, I love this. Right, Dan Crenshaw, and I played you this, where Dan Crenshaw called out Tucker Carlson, saying, I wouldn't take advice from Tucker Carlson, doesn't know what he's talking about. But what I found out since is that there has been a hot mic incident after that interview with GB News. Check this out.
Have you ever met Tucker?
We've talked a lot. I met him on Twitter, blah, blah, blah. If I ever met him, I'd effing kill him, he said, Dan Crenshaw. He said he's the worst I think he might have actually said he's the worst person on earth. He's at least said he's the worst person, I think. Now, this has caused a massive fight. Tucker Carlson is pro-Russia. Dan Crenshaw, who is super conservative, but he's also really supportive of Ukraine and was against people being anti-Ukraine in the way they were in the MAGA movement, is at loggerheads with Tucker Carlson. This is causing a right fracas because he's on a hot mic, and that's been leaked, said exactly what he said.
Have you ever?
If I ever meet him, I'll effing kill him. He's the worst. I don't really disagree with you. And many of you will have seen this. This is not to do with Ukraine, but you can draw parallels. So the kind of rare earth metals deal that Trump wanted originally looks very much like this. Ching, ching, ching. Dollar signs, dollar signs. This is what Trump shared this morning, UK time, on his Truth Social platform. He shared this. He likes this. He advocates this. This is turning Gaza into a Riviera of the Middle East. This is an absolutely insanely distasteful video. This is a view inside Trump's head.
Look, everyone, it's Donald Trump. He's come to save Gaza. Ooh, Donald Trump, he'll save our dignity. Just don't ask where the people are, or he'll throw you in the sea. Yeah.
You've got Musk lookalikes, you've got Trump, golden Trump statues, golden Trump balloons, money being thrown everywhere. It makes me sick. But I thought I'd leave that with you. Take care, guys, and speak to you soon. Toodle pips.